Very amused to see that I had been assigned the Sunday sermon slot since I have a degree in theology. So my beginning is to read from the Gospel of the book of President Ronald Reagan, and one of his most famous sayings. The 9 most terrifying words in the English language are, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." Now, sometimes governments do nothing, which from a libertarian standpoint is not always a bad thing. But alas for us, too often governments do something, and these things tend to take the forms of invasions of our personal liberties from the cradle to the grave. I personally remember being enticed by the siren song of feminism back in the 70s, and Betty Friedan by that time had written a book which was published in 1963, and it was called The Feminine Mystique. And Betty Friedan had done interviews with a couple of hundred women or more, and all of a sudden they were telling her that they were so unhappy being wives and mothers, and they were frustrated because they couldn't have careers and have it all, as the phrase became known. And so this movement began, and so many women entered the workforce in America all at once that several sociologists and commentators said that this was one of the greatest phenomenons of the 20th century in America. Later on, when I did write a book about it, I tried to pitch the title Femnomenon and was told it sounded too much like a word you made up to sell a book, which I thought was interesting. But 20 years later, I did write a book, Equal to the Task. I had two cohorts on the project. Joan Mills was a woman who did executive recruiting. She said, I spend half my day talking to corporations who think they want to or need to hire women, and the other half of the time talking to women who think they want to work for corporations, and there's something that's not jiving. So I'm not a writer, but I think there's a book in there, so I agreed to write the book with her. And she did all the interviews. We also took the position that men were equal victims of cultural change, sort of took the Margaret Mead approach. And we were kind of shunned by the women in the business world in San Francisco because we were talking to the enemy. That's how crazy it was back then. I'm not sure it's changed all that much now. So we made this book proposal up, and our agent circulated it in New York, and it was purchased within 2 weeks by Seaview Books, which then was a wholly owned subsidiary of all things Playboy Enterprises. And my theory was that they wanted to prove by buying this book that they were interested in all kinds of working women. Equal rights for women became the battle cry of the women's liberation movement, and I stress that, women's liberation. Yet almost as soon as the battle started, events took what I call a very hard bureaucratic turn to the left. So women were not making progress in climbing the corporate ladder fast enough in their minds, and there were also problems getting into law schools and medical schools. So women decided that they would turn to the government for help, and they established all of these affirmative action programs and equal opportunity programs, and so quotas were instituted. And because of that, a whole group of consulting companies were born, all of which ran to the government and said, we'll make sure that all the corporations follow all your guidelines and hire enough women and minorities. So there became this huge kind of symbiotic network of people. And of course, what happened was the corporations who were trying to actually just make a profit and produce products were suddenly besieged by all these legal requirements to hire enough women and force them in the door. So after the story we just heard, it seems kind of sad to think about all these women back in the 70s and 80s wanting equal rights, and they felt that their human rights had been unjustly harmed. And so I call that a faux human rights campaign that got heavily seasoned with what became known as the victimology syndrome. There was a whole new bureaucracy that had to be formed, the Equal Opportunities Employment Commission, the EEOC, and it was, of course, paid for by the taxpayers. So women were getting jobs to pay taxes, to create bureaucracies. Bureaucracies were hiring consultants to really make life miserable for corporations, and it just was not a very happy situation. And what's, I think, ironic about that is that here were women who wanted to be liberated from the patriarchy. They wanted to get out from under this system where the men ruled the world, and they ended up creating a system where they turned to big father government. That's what I like to call it. And so that kind of gave the government even more permission, I think, to interfere in the lives of women and their families. At this point in time, we have so many government agencies and so many rules and dictates. It's just grown exponentially, and I think a lot of it came from the fact that women sort of tacitly or overtly gave governments permission to run all the parts of their lives. The question always comes up, why do so many women turn to progressive or statism viewpoints, worldviews? And there have been some studies about that. It's all pretty obvious. Women avoid confrontation on the whole. It's very rare that women like to actually confront things, and so having a big government take care of you and create the safety nets and be your champion, quote unquote, and do things for you is an easier way to get along in the world. And so women are sociable creatures. They're the nesters of the world, so they like the idea of socialism. They're also the caregivers of their families, so that's also kind of a quality of nesting. And that didn't really work all that well in the corporate world. We used to call that in the book, we call it hair ribbons in the races. They were trying to get to the top of the corporate ladder, but they kept trying to wear the hair ribbons as well and be feminine. And there were whole debates about fashion, how long you should wear your skirts and all the sexist things that came up. And then the hypersensitivity and reporting men for just making a joke and creating all kinds of problems within the corporations. So what ended up happening is that I think feminism became actually a collectivist movement, and that of course aligned itself with the progressive or left-wing parties in America. And also, sadly enough, when we talk to women in corporate America, not a whole lot of them understood free market economics. Here they were going into corporations that were trying to produce something, and the women just didn't understand because that was not something they were taught or encouraged to learn. My father was different. When I was a little girl, I very firmly remember him telling me that if I didn't learn about economics, I might as well just die. So a little on the other side of things, but that was Dad. So on Thursday, our colleague Chris Lingle talked about the big food production giveaway program in India that was started up before one of the election campaigns. And that made me think of all these products, or programs rather, that women became involved in, one of which was called the government program of the War on Poverty. And recently, a woman named Star Parker, I love that name, wrote a book, and only an African-American woman could have gotten away with using this title, Uncle Sam's Plantation. It was her expose on how the primarily Democrat Party had continued all these programs, and it actually made women more dependent. Now, Star was a drug-addicted welfare recipient herself who turned her life around and started an organization called CURE, which I'll talk just a tiny bit about later. But the whole purpose of CURE is to get women off of what she calls the addiction to government and welfare dependency. And the problem of welfare dependency has reached epidemic proportions in the last 5 years. Lyndon Johnson, president after JFK was assassinated, declared this war on poverty. And ironically, back in the mid-1960s, the poverty level in the US had fallen a staggering 3.4% just in 5 years' time between 1959 and 1964. So it was just under 19%, the poverty level in the US, which still was not all that great. But this just goes to prove one of my laws of life, and that is that good news never stops a politician from leaving well enough alone. As part of the war on poverty, they started something called the food stamp program. And originally they were little paper books that you could tear out when you went to the grocery store, hand them to the clerk at the checkout counters, and you would get discounts, or some of your food would be subsidized. At the start of that program, there were only 2.8 million families receiving these food stamps. Now, believe it or not, in 2012, there were 47 million families in America receiving food stamp or supplement cards. And that's 1 out of every 7 households in America are on food stamps. Now, obviously, this means that the war on poverty was a bit of a failure, but that's nothing new in the political world. And it's gotten even worse because now the Obama administration has started running television advertisements on Hispanic television stations, encouraging people, including illegal aliens, to sign up for the food stamp program. I mean, they're actually using our tax dollars to advertise to get more people on welfare. It's just an amazing concept. And when people say, can you do that? And I said, yes, he can. Apparently so. The food stamp program itself is very ironic if you think about it as well. Food stamps can be used not just to buy food, which you would hopefully think would be healthy things, but no. They also can be used to buy like fizzy drinks, sodas, junk food, and so on. So Mrs. Obama's vegetable patch in the White House garden may be good for her daughters, but the rest of the poverty-stricken people in America, and not so poverty-stricken, of course, like any system, it gets gamed and people, use the program and just kind of take the benefits and enjoy life as much as they can. So recently, one of the conservative politicians decided that he wanted to try to amend the food stamp program so that people could no longer use them to buy fizzy drinks and potato chips. And he was dumped on big time by the soft drink, cookie, and potato chip manufacturers who make billions of dollars every year in their companies by having food stamps cover their products. So now you can see that there's all this unhealthy food being consumed and all these poor people who are having terrible health problems, which is, of course, one of the reasons that we need Obamacare. It's a vicious circle. But there are countless other examples. I didn't want to be an Amero-centric speaker, so I went out and I looked at some other cases in other countries about what's happening between governments and women. And what I find, again, so sad about this, in the States right now, the Democrat or left-wing sort of leaning party has continued to beat this drum that says that the Republicans, or conservative party, wants to have this war on women. And mostly they center it around the abortion issue. But every day, I started a Google alert, war on women, and I must get 3 or 4 articles every day in Google alerts about the Republicans have done this in the war on women, and they're always persecuting women. And people just don't really analyze, deconstruct this whole charge, and it's gotten to be absurd. So here are some of the other things that are happening to women around the world. In Turkey, the government has unveiled, and I said that's pun intended, tough new prison sentences for women who have abortions. Prime Minister Erdogan is on record as labeling abortion murder. And despite protests, since abortions have long been allowed early in pregnancies in Turkey, any woman now who has an abortion after the 10th week of her pregnancy faces a 3-year jail term. So when I hear these war on women things in the States and I look on that, I think that's a little bit more of a war on women. In India, if a woman knows that she's going to have a boy baby, she'll receive better prenatal treatment during her pregnancy, because the Indian government, even though it's outlawed tests to determine the gender of a baby, realizes, and they've installed tough penalties for finding out the gender of your baby ahead of time. They don't have any way of keeping other countries from sending gender determining tests into India. So that's how the parents learn, and they know if they're going to have a boy, wife gets better care. And this is the practice of getting pregnancy tests to determine gender also are very common in Bangladesh, Pakistan, and China. Now, if you add to this the Chinese government's one child per family policy, you can understand that you're having a recipe for a demographic disaster. There are too many men and not enough women. So one of the things that's being discussed is whether or not the Chinese government should investigate having a favorable stance on polygamy so that all these women can be married to a single man, and then you won't have all these unmarried women running around. And the government of Morocco is probably a good place for them to start getting consulting advice, because Morocco is now considering the legitimization of polygamous marriages. Also in the Middle East, we all know that educating young Muslim women can be hazardous to their health. We've all heard the story of Malala Yousafzai, the 16-year-old Pakistani girl who was shot in the head by members of the Taliban on her way to school. her miraculous recovery and bravery are becoming legendary stories, a legendary story. She went from bleeding on a school bus to within a year addressing the United Nations about what was happening to young women in Muslim countries who wanted to be educated. There have been other instances where smoke bombs and other things have been done to the schools that are educating women. So, and in Saudi Arabia, although they are still not allowed to drive, Saudi women can work under Sharia law. So the Saudi government decided that because they didn't want women and men interacting, they built an exclusive city, literally a little industrial city where only women are allowed to work. And they're building a second city right now because this is such a popular system. So the name of the group that is in charge of this is the Saudi Industrial Property Authority. And the question is, were they referring to the property on which the city was built, or were they referring to the women as the property? But in any way, there also have been progressions in freedoms for Muslim women in other territories that you wouldn't think of at the top of your head. Muslim women are now allowed to wear a special kind of nail polish. They had to actually invent a kind of nail polish that followed Sharia law and proscriptions against what you could put on your body. On a more serious note, female genital mutilation has declined somewhat in the Middle East and in Africa because there have been groups going around teaching about the dangers of it, the infections, the long-term effects on the ability of women to have children. And sadly, London has now been declared the European capital for female genital mutilation. Once again, the British government realizes that it can't do anything. It's impossible to legislate against it. I mean, it's done kind of in private and within the communities. So they didn't want to appear to be doing nothing. So what they did is pledge £35 million toward the global eradication of female genital mutilation, and they're delivering this money through international aid agencies. So the United Kingdom seems to be building up quite a track record in things that they can't fix with legislation. They realize that just thousands of young girls are taken out of the country every year. In one city alone, I wrote about a couple of years ago, 2,500 young women disappeared from the educational system in Bradford, the city of Bradford, and most of those were being taken off for arranged marriages. Well, once again, as I said, the British government couldn't do anything about it. You can't legislate against that cultural practice. But they wanted to try, so they started something under the government that was called the Forced Marriage Unit. And they tried to deal with this problem, but there's not much they can do except go around to the schools and try to have community outreach programs and explain why forced marriages are not really a civilized thing to do to young people if you're living in the country. So now the girls themselves have started this underground system of passing along the information. They've come up with a way to avoid getting taken out of the country. They tell their sisters, put 2 spoons in your clothing. So when you're at the airport and you go through the metal detectors, they go off. And you're taken aside, you're separated from your parents and taken into side rooms to be questioned. And that's when you can ask for political asylum. So the girls have figured out it's the spoon system, but it seems to work. Just to show you how absolutely insane, this is the end of the spectrum of insanity for me. Muslim men who apply to be enter into British society, into the United Kingdom, are allowed, if they're already married to them, to bring up to 4 of their wives. And all of them, as soon as they arrive, are getting onto the National Health Service. And one of the benefits that they are allowed to apply for is if you know you're going to be getting married, and it's very important in the Islamic world to be a virgin when you get married, there is a surgery that can be performed which actually creates an artificial hymen. And so on your wedding night, your husband will think that he's having sex with a virgin. And the National Health Service is now actually covering that as one of the procedures. So again, the taxpayers are paying for artificial hymens. Love that one. To see how easily women can still get confused about their role vis-a-vis the government, in the Ukraine, there's a women's group named Femen, or Femen, and they take off their clothing and they have bare-breasted protests, which obviously gets a lot of press attention. And soon after they began holding these bare-breasted protests, they started to get assaulted and hit on by men. I mean, obviously, it seemed like a great invitation to the men. So here are these women. They're protesting against the government, who's filed criminal charges against the group and trying to put them in jail for unacceptable public behavior. And when the women start getting harassed by men, they turn to the government and ask them to be protected, asked that they would be protected by the government that they were protesting against. One of my culture heroines is a professor, author, and essayist, and avowed libertarian, and lesbian, I should say, Camille Paglia. And a few days ago, I came across a quote that she made. I'm a feminist, now what? So the interviewer said, "How do you feel about feminism?" And she said, "Oh, feminism? Is it still alive? Thanks for the tip." It sure is invisible, except for the random whining of some mal-educated products of the elite schools who found plush berths in jobs in glossy magazines. The leadership vacuum among women is alarming. It's very distressing. For example, the atrocities against women in India, the shocking series of gang rapes, which never seem to end, have not been aggressively condemned in a sustained way by any feminist organizations in the US. I want to hear, she said, someone going crazy about it in the media and not letting up day after day, week after week. The true mission of feminism today is not to carp about the woes of affluent Western career women, but to turn the spotlight on the life and death issues affecting women in the third world, particularly in rural areas where they have little protection against exploitation and injustice. I couldn't agree more. On our first day here together, Professor Lark asked us to look at how we talked about libertarian beliefs and views to other people, and I wanted to focus just on maybe how to talk to women about being libertarians and how to get them to realize that they are libertarians. When I moved to San Francisco in 1975, as Christiane said, I joined a group of 13, actually 12 other women. I was the 13th member of Women Entrepreneurs. I was asked to join by our landlady, who said, "I just joined this group called Women Entrepreneurs. There are 12 of us, and if you join and you vote for me, I'll be elected the group's first president." I said, "Well, the technical problem is I don't really own a business." She said, "Give me $500 and you can run the mail order division of my gift shop." So I gave her a check for $500, went to the first meeting, became a member of Women Entrepreneurs. We held the election. She lost. She quit the organization and never came back. And so I stayed in the group. I was new in town. I thought having 12 friends was better than nothing. So I started the group's newsletter, which was called Prospectus. And I printed the copies myself, and I handed them out to the members. And I said, "I want you all to go out into the community, find other women business owners, hand out these newsletters, and we'll see how well we can do in increasing the membership." Well, by the end of that year, we had 70 members. So we went from 13 to 70 in 12 months. And at that point, I was elected the group's second president, which really ticked off the landlady, so we had to move. And, by the end of my first term in office, we had 370 members. And we became, actually statistically, the largest group of women business owners in all of the United States. It was an amazing adventure, and by that time I decided, well, I did so well making a little newsletter for a little group, maybe I should do a national newsletter. And I did my research and discovered that there already was one. It was called Enterprising Women. It was based in New York, and I thought, oh shucks, a New York businesswoman, she's probably very hard-hearted and very tough to deal with. But it turned out that Ava was so welcoming. She said, "I knew you were out there somewhere," and we became fast friends. And she said, "I think I want you to be my West Coast business partner and manage Enterprising Women out West." And so we're having Women in Business Week in New York. I had this vision of it, and it starts in 2 weeks. So get on an airplane and come to New York. So I got off the plane on a Sunday night, got dressed, went to the hotel where the first events were being held, and I met Ava, shook her hand, we hugged and said hello, and I turned around and there was the mayor at the time, Abe Beam, and Ava just said, "Hi, Mayor Beam, this is my West Coast business partner, Sue Easton." Oh, hi, how are you? It was just an amazing week. And we did actually get really off the ground pretty quickly at that point because President Carter started a task force on women's business ownership. He actually did do one good thing, and that might have been the only one. And why was he focused on that? Because in 1976, for the first time, the U.S. Census Bureau reported on the number of women business owners in America. And the number so staggered the New York Times that it ran the story on the front page of the Sunday New York Times, right in the center. 250,000 women own businesses in America. This is mind-blowing to the general public, apparently. And last year, when they took the same count, there were 8 million women-owned businesses in America. Now, I mention this because if there was ever an audience that should be receptive to libertarianism, women entrepreneurs should be like #1 on the list. And the reason, of course, is that because they understand the insanity of taxation and making all the applying for licenses and having to follow all the crazy regulations that governments can throw up in your path. And now they've got Obamacare to deal with. A lot of companies are reducing the number of hours an employee can work to 30 because after 30 hours per week, a different section of Obamacare kicks in. So they have now all these women who are trying to make a living being employees, and they're having their hours reduced and therefore their salaries reduced because another government program is being put in place. So my advice to any of you is when you go out and you're going to just have a conference like this one or any other, try to find as many women business owners as you can and invite them to come and understand what libertarianism is about, because I guarantee you those 370 women in the group when I was running it, Women Entrepreneurs, became libertarians largely. Jim Elwood knows because he lives in San Francisco. They're all over the place. And we had outreach programs. We mentored one another. It was really an amazing process. But there's another group of women who, I love this slide, never underestimate the power of an extremely pissed off woman. There's so many women I've also met along the way who decided not to go the corporate route and not to own their own businesses, but to face the problems that they saw in society. And they created all kinds of independent institutes. One of them is the Independent Institute. Mary Thoreau and her husband David co-founded that one. It's in Oakland, California. And they are now considered one of the top 50 think tanks in the US. And whenever they have programs, as they did recently on spying and government invasions of our privacy, it was covered by a national television network called C-SPAN, which has all government programming. And also they have, on weekends, they run book TV and they interview a lot of libertarian authors. C-SPAN also came, as it always does, to Freedom Fest in July in Las Vegas, where there were 2,500 attendees this time around. And they covered a lot of the sessions and interviewed a lot of the libertarian authors. Another one that I've just learned about is I met Christy Higranes. She runs the Global Press Institute. She went out to women in 26 countries, mostly developing countries, and she has come up with a program to encourage women to be reporters on the ground in their own communities. So she's developing her own flock of foreign correspondents on the ground, but they're not foreign, they're actually living in the countries they're reporting on. And now she's created a separate platform so they get paid. She's got a syndication system in place now. So here are all these women who didn't ever think of themselves as journalists, learning to write articles, turning them over to Christy, and she distributes them through her syndication platform, and they make money. So they're actually, she's empowered all these women to be reporters. She's also based in San Francisco. I mean, we are the world's largest outdoor lunatic asylum, but there are lots of interesting people you can meet there. I mentioned earlier CURE, Star Parker's group. It's called the Center for Urban Renewal and Education. And her goal is to create public policy to fight poverty. And she advocates for social policies to get women, especially, away from government dependency. Here in Europe, we have the Hayek Institute in Germany. Barbara Kolm is the general secretary, and of course, it's an Austrian economics organization. Over the summer months, Barbara organizes what she calls the Free Market Roadshow. She gets a whole bunch of economists together, and they travel from country to country, especially in former communist bloc countries, and literally holds free market seminars. Very popular, and they get a lot of good press. So our message of libertarianism is getting spread. So my brief conclusions are, feminism was, I love the bells. This is, you know, for a theologian, this is really great. I didn't pay them to do that, by the way. So my observations are that feminism was supposed to be a movement of women toward liberation, but it ended up being co-opted by leftist progressive elites. And they do little to speak out against the problem of government dependency because mostly they're running the programs that create it. And they don't seem to have very great sensitivity. I mean, women are supposed to be the sensitive ones. They don't seem to have sensitivity to the dreams and goals of women who want to be really liberated. Governments themselves and have created such diverse, intrusive policies that it's getting really crazy. They are so into micromanaging. Of course, I don't know if you know that in New York, the current mayor of New York City, Mr. Bloomberg, and his giant empire, he's just doing all sorts of crazy things. He wants to limit the size of sodas that you can get at McDonald's to 16 ounces. He had people take salt and pepper shakers off the tables in restaurants, so you had to ask for them because everyone knows salt is bad for you. He's going after hospitals who give information or away free samples of milk formula to mothers of newborns because everybody knows they should be breastfed. So he actually has people going around to hospitals looking for those that are giving away free formula. And on a greater scale, we have this environmental movement that has gotten these eco-friendly light bulbs, the one that look like whipped cream, and they have mercury in them. So if you're a mother and you've got little kids and one of them knocks over a lamp and one of these light bulbs gets broken, because of the mercury, it takes, if you do it correctly, it takes a half an hour, the equivalent of a hazardous material or hazmat cleanup, to get all the pieces away safely so your kids aren't contaminated with mercury. And of course, before these light bulbs were literally forced on people to buy, they're taking all the regular incandescent light bulbs off the market. And people have been stockpiling light bulbs in their garages now for a couple of years as they've been phased out all over the country. And of course, one of the things I learned is that pretty much the same time that these hazmat light bulbs were put up for sale, somebody in just about every city got a contract to do the collection of the light bulbs. So another government bureaucracy created the need for another crony capitalist system to clean up the light bulbs and dispose of them properly. So libertarians should take every opportunity to remind government-dependent women who are also regulatory oppressed that when Big Father makes unsustainable promises, economies collapse and the social order begins to fray and splinter, and women usually are the ones who bear the brunt of the disintegration. Without economic freedom, women have little hope of achieving self-sufficiency and individual liberty. Progressive politicians continue to enact policies which are not free market oriented, and this just continues to foster ever bigger government. Women entrepreneurs, again, are most likely to be joining the libertarian reformation because they understand how governments create these unnecessary obstacles to progress and growth. And so finally, I want everybody, whether you're a man or a woman, to go forth, especially after my title about unprotected government intercourse. I found this T-shirt, which, pardon the language, but I don't need sex, the government, every day. So this is the libertarian battle cry now for women. So there you are. Just a few quick thoughts.